Yesterday we started the Raya. That's almost literally their sole basis for their Hanocha, their assumption. At least it's a major cornerstone in assuming that the Murex is the Techeles, is the Chilazon Techeles. And it was a very strong proof. But as we look into it, I think we'll see that it's really self-refuting. It incriminates itself. It's a beautiful raya, but it's shuvasei b'tzidai. Now the raya, again, just to go over the raya in a nutshell, is that the Gemara says that there's only Rabbeinu Shalom, there's only one who could be mavchin between a beged that was dyed with authentic Techeles and the imitation of the ilan, indigo, a plant. And when you look at Itake, these two materials, these two dyes, the murex and the indigo, are so similar to each other that chemically they're identical to each other. And so therefore that's mamish pshat in the Gemara that says that no one could be mavchin. Only the Rabbeinu Shalom himself could be mavchin, and he's also para from somebody who's going to put on kol ilan and say that he has Techeles. Rav Shlomo Miller said that itself is the gresta kasha on assuming that the murex is the chilazon. And the reason is because you find the Gemara in Menachos. Chazal devised a test in order to tell when somebody brings a beged to know whether or not it's authentic Techeles or if it's the imitation of kol ilan. Chazal gave a test for it. And to tell you exactly what to do, the Gemara, as a matter of fact, Chazal give two tests, and the Gemara says that these two tests, they complement each other. The Gemara says like this: Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rabbi Yehuda Badiklei. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rabbi Yehuda actually checked it out. Maisi Magve Gila. He would bring something that's called alum. Rashi says, Umaya de Shavulusa. And he'd bring the liquid that you get from a plant that's called a funny Greek plant. Umeiraglayim ben arboim yoim. And you bring urine that's 40 days old, Rashi says, or from a child that's over 40 days old. Child that's under 40 days, his meiraglayim, his urine, is literally water. But over 40 days old, there's a lot of ammonia in it. It fermented itself. And the Melech Chazal say that that's the test that you could tell. You leave the beged that has the Techeles on it, that has the blue dye on it, you leave it in overnight, and you see if it fades by the morning, then you know that it's kol ilan. If it doesn't fade, then you can assume that it's Techeles. Now if the way they're saying, which is true, that the indigo from the plant base and the indigo from the murex is so identical that literally their molecular structure are the same, so it's impossible for any test that Chazal should give to make a chilik that one of them, the Techeles, should pass the test and that the plant indigo would fail it. Because whatever you're accomplishing is going to do it in both. They're both identical. It's impossible. If in a lab they're the same, so then no test is going to be able to make a chilik between them. So what are the proponents, what do they say? So they say the following. They say that the test was not designed to hit the dye and see the difference in the dye. It was designated to detect the impurities of the murex dye, which means that every murex dye, when you automatically, there's going to be some snail meat left inside it, which that you don't have by the plant indigo. And this test is supposed to show you those impurities, supposed to detect those impurities. And therefore, if it fades away, that means that there was impurity. If it fades away, that means that there was no meat in it, and it just made the plant base. And if it passes the test and it stays strong and steadfast, then you know that it has that meat of the snail in it. In other words, this would mean that the test was for a very side incidental property that happens to be in the murex that doesn't exist in the plant indigo. And that's not mistaber. It sounds pashtus that what you're detecting is the fundamental properties of the dyes themselves. And if somebody thinks otherwise, what he basically is misunderstanding is a lack of understanding of the tests that Chazal gave. Just by seeing it, you can't be mouth. It means that they, in those days they didn't have the lab. If you ask every scientist and chemists that ever worked on this, whether they're pro or they're against, starting from the professor, the chemist that Rabbi Herzog worked with was Professor Green, they all, when they saw the Chazal, what Chazal gave the simonim over here of what materials and what chemicals and herbs to put in to get this test, they all understood that what Chazal were doing was they were doing a process of reduction. And that means the following. We once went through this on the other side. When you take the dye from either plant-based indigo or from the murex indigo, and you get out the dye itself, it will not adhere. It won't stick. It won't fasten itself to wool. It will go in, and as soon as you wash it, it will sort of rinse out and fade away. And that they knew in the times of Chazal. They always knew that there has to be a way that you make it that it stays steadfast to the beged. And the way they did it is that they understood that the dye itself, the way it comes out from the murex, the reason why it doesn't stick is because it's not a water-based dye. It has to be dissolved, has to be able to be mixed together with water. It has to be what they call water soluble. Once you have the water soluble, then it can penetrate into the wool, it sticks to it, and then even after you get it back to non-soluble, non-water soluble, it will still stay in there. And we said when you start off, it's very dark, it's a purple dye, and what they do is, that state it's not going to stick to the wool. The way they do it is, they put very, very strong chemicals, pH it's called, they put in very strong chemicals that basically pulls out all the oxygen from the dye. When you take out all the oxygen, what it changes into a clear, it's called a leuco state, a clearish, yellowish, turns yellow, mamish magic, turns from purple to yellow. That state now it's water soluble, you put the wool into it, and it adheres, fastens itself to the wool. And then as soon as you take it out and expose it to oxygen again, not even to the light, that was to get it blue, just to take it out and bring it into the oxygen, it gets oxidized, reoxidized, like magic, it turns blue again, because like its original state, except that now already was absorbed in it, and it stays very, very strong to it. That's the process of getting it into the wool. And what these chemists all said, that this Chazal, these things, that these herbs and chemicals that Chazal are giving you, they are not obviously as concentrated as what they have today, but their properties are the same, and their Techeles is the same thing. In those days, when they used to take the dye and wanted to get the wool to get absorbed to it, they also did a reduction process. And that reduction, if you're doing indigo, I'm talking about not Techeles, indigo, they would do the same thing that they have in this Simonim Chazal. It would take them about 7 to 12 days sitting in a pot with the lid covered, sealed as much as they could so that the oxygen doesn't get in. And these chemicals that Chazal say would take out the oxygen very slowly, and then eventually would turn into this clear state, and they would put in the wool. This Simonim of Chazal are identical, they say, to those properties that they're looking for to make a reduction. And what they do is, when you have a beged that's already blue, it has already dyed blue, and you want to tell if it's the true hilazim or if it's indigo, what you're doing is you're putting it into the same type of a vat with the same materials of meraglayim, which has a lot of ammonia, which also does this reduction thing. And then when you leave it in overnight, just like it made the purple dye yellow, So too, this purple dye that's now oxidated and has oxygen in it, that's why it's blue on the beged. When you put it into this and leave it overnight, if it fades towards a yellowish color, what you basically did was you reduced it into its glucose state. Maybe not as strong, it wasn't 7 days, but it was overnight. They were able to see already if it's starting to fade. So that test is basically the same thing like taking the blue ink, the blue dye originally, and making it yellowish by reducing it. That they did in order to get it water soluble, to get absorbed. They're taking this beggar, which is already blue, and they're again making a new reduction to it to see if it would fade away and turn yellowish. And if it does, that means that it's either a plant-based, but it's indigo, it's not the chilazin. And therefore, since that's the test of Chazal, it makes no difference the impurities of the meat that you're going to have in it, because that's not the function of this test, not to detect the impurities of the meat from the snail. What its tachlis is to hit the actual dye itself. The properties of the dye of an indigo or the murex, whether it comes from plant indigo, is going to fade when you put it into these chemicals because you're reducing it. And therefore, if somebody says that what you're basically doing is check if there's impurities, according to just about every single chemist, pro or against, I'll show you nuschayis maybe tomorrow, Mr. Shem, that it's misunderstanding the whole chemical procedure over here. So bottom line is, the aside is that this rye that they bring is gufa rye for carrot, because the real Techeles would not fade at all. And both of these are going to fade. Now, they tried, maybe didn't fade because they're not clear on how to use the Chazal's testing. But the bottom line is that whether it's indigo from a plant or whether it's indigo from a murex, since they're chemically the exact same makeup, there's no way that a test is going to make a chilik and one will pass, one will fail. And what Chazal over here were trying to make fail was exactly the murex indigo, same as the regular indigo, which had a matzvah, you were able to reduce it. Regular tails, the cuttlefish, and that, you're not, when you mix it together with all those chemicals that they use, it's nothing to do with reducing it. The dye in itself is able to absorb right away to the baguette. They're doing it to make it blue. Okay, fine, so that's maybe a R on it, but I'm saying they're making it blue, but bottom line is, it's not a reducing it to get it into the baguette so that it should fail, this beginner. So Meir Leban have seen that this test, l'chayra, is the same reduction that they did originally, and they probably had the same pots that they had it originally. That's they just put the Techeles into those pots, which they had the reducing chemicals in it, and they just checked it overnight inside. And so therefore, Rav Shlomo Miller says that this is bad in the Grester Rai. The fact that they're so similar shows that it can't be the Techeles Chilazin, and it's included in Chazal's Kol ilan. Let's continue tomorrow.